This is the first of a series of presentations about Sheldon as a township in Vermont experiencing a tourist boom with hotels and springs, primarily in the second half of the 1800s and dwindling off by the beginning of the 1900s. This presentation is by Harold Smith in conjunction with research completed by the Sheldon Historical Society. This map of Sheldon, produced in 1857 prior to the official Beers map of 1871, shows a pentagonal shaped township surrounded by Highgate, Franklin, Enosburg, and Fairfield. The primary characteristic of Sheldon is as a river valley encompassing the Missisquoi River from where it enters the town on the east near Enosburg, moving all the way down to where it joins the Black Creek, coming out of Sheldon Creek, and then going rest of the way down through into Highgate. This is a detailed 1871 map of Sheldon showing basically the same things. It also shows East Sheldon as well as Sheldon Junction. And on a separate page in this particular book is Sheldon Creek, or sometimes known as Black Creek. The precursor to causing a craze about mineral waters was due in part by the health of the nation brought about by a number of epidemics in the 1800s. We are currently in the COVID-19 pandemic, but it is not the first of the many epidemics and pandemics that have influenced Sheldon and Franklin County. In 1820 and again in 1852, there were yellow fever scares and epidemics, and people were admitted to hospitals very similar to the one that is here in the background. In 1832, 33, and again in 1834, there were outbreaks of cholera, which took multiple lives. In 1837, there was typhoid, which also took people from the New England states. The influenza epidemics of 1847 and 1889 were particularly severe in the northeastern United States. And last, of great severity, was a bubonic plague which affected the whole nation between 1855 and 1860. So as you can see from this collection, the country, prior to the Civil War, had experienced a number of health problems. And then we go to the American Civil War, which was between 1861 and 1865. It was a deadly war with people having combat deaths of 205,000. However, according to HistoryNet, the infection rate was extremely high and resulted in 250,000 additional deaths. In the background is a typical field hospital of the civilian war era. Little or no hygiene was practiced. Anesthesia was almost not in existence. So if you had a bullet in you, it would be dug out, usually with the aid of nothing other than a knife and fingers. And if you had a limb which was crushed or broken, it was often removed with a standard handsaw without the assistance of antiseptics or anesthesia. These were indeed horrible medical practices through this period of time. It wasn't until 1944 that the Public Health Service came into existence. It was to oversee the health of the United States. The first Surgeon General had been appointed in 1899, and his only authority really was to work with the marine hospitals. They were hospitals that were used primarily to treat sailors. Right after the Civil War, all the way around the United States and to some degree the world, there was a mineral springs craze in which people seemed to discover good health as a result of drinking certain water and then bathing in certain water. Vermont was not exempt. There were springs in Highgate, Alburgh, Middletown, and the ones in Sheldon. Sheldon rose during this period of time to become the mecca of mineral springs and healing waters in the eastern United States, resulting in an extreme tourist boom in the small rural village. But this wasn't the first time that the spring or springs had been used for medicinal purposes. We read in history that the medicine springs were known to the Native American population, primarily the Abenakis who lived along the shores of Lake Champlain. They would come inland to what we've been able to identify as Sheldon to perform certain religious and medicinal rites for people who were ill. It was known to them, and they had been using it for some time, when the first European showed up on the premises to any degree, and that was Samuel Champlain in 1609. He is the sailor who left Europe, traveled on the north course into the current river that at that point in time had no name, up the river and came to what is currently the Richelieu River, having not discovered up to that point in time any land passage through to the west, to the Indies, East Indies. He chose to go up the Richelieu and, following the advice of some of the Native Americans, landed in Lake Champlain. From the current location on what is the St. Lawrence River to the location of about Missisquoi Bay was an arduous trip for people who were used to sailing through wind and on the ocean. It took a good deal out of his sailors, and by the time they got to Lake Champlain, they were sick, they were tired, they were emaciated, and they were ready to quit. The Indians knew of healing waters, and so therefore they said to Champlain that they would go inland and get for him in animal skins some healing waters that would take care of his sailors. And they did just that. They went into the Sheldon area and they brought back skins full of water from what we would now refer to as Sheldon Springs. Well, now, of course, the sailors had time enough to sit around and do not much of anything while the Indians were going that distance of probably around 12 miles. And so therefore, without much work to do and having access to fresh fish and some fresh food coming from their Native American friends, they did recover some strength, but when the water came back and they drank it, they found that they were cured from all of the illnesses that they had acquired. And so the first European use that resulted in a cure from mineral waters was in 1609. During the mid 1800s, around 1850, there was an article that appeared in the public press in regards to the situation of medicine and of other facilities for creating cures. I will read it to you. Quote, whether there is any real progress in medicine is often questioned, but however this may be, it is certain there is progress out of it. It is being gradually replaced with other restorative agencies. Ill practice of treating disease by drug has, to a very considerable extent, given way to hygienic measures. Among them, changes of air is increasingly sought by invalids of all countries. This resource is becoming more and more available to the invalid class with the multiple facilities of cheap and comfortable transportation. Interpretation, the clean airs of northern Vermont and other places were available to multiples of people due primarily to the advent of the railroad, which at this point in time now had been extended from New York City all the way into Montreal. Prior to that, in around 1800, Mr. Kimball and Mr. Draper got together and they purchased the land on which the Indians had this medicinal spring. And later on, Mr. Draper sold out to Mr. Kimball, and it therefore became known as Kimball Springs. Mr. Kimball was not an entrepreneur, and he saw no reason to charge anyone for using or drinking his water, and so therefore he gave water away to anyone who came with any kind of jugs or bottles and wished to use it. As a result, the Sheldon natives, the people who had been here for some time, were able to drink water that they considered to be pure and cool and have a favorable taste to it. And so the water had been being used for pretty close to 60 years before anybody else came in to use it. 1871 map, which is the official map of the U.S. government for all of the physical locations in the United States, that we're going to present to you shows Sheldon Springs, also known as Olmsted Springs, Sheldon Creek, also known as Black Creek, and Sheldon Junction, as well as some nearby locations to pin down for you the location of springs. Sheldon Springs, which is right now known as Sheldon Springs, was originally known as Olmsted or Olmsted Falls, albeit because of the Olmsteds. And right here in this red circle is the past and current location of what we know as Sheldon Springs. And right about here, a little further out, is Congress Hotel. We'll cover a little later. As you can see, this is on the rail. This would be the St. Albans to Franklin Railroad. This road right here would be called the Plank Road, which went from St. Albans into North Sheldon as a road built over logs. A little bumpy, but not muddy. And over here is the Lamoille Valley Railroad. This is the location we will take you down and show you the spring in a future episode. And up right about in this area right here, okay, is where the Missisquoi Hotel is going to be found. This is a map of Missisquoi Springs, drawn at the time, and it was in mostly in use by tourists. It had grown to be pretty big before it closed down. The exact location is right here is the Missisquoi River. Just as it starts to bend back this way, there is still, and we'll show to you, a swamp right here. And right here is where the bottling plant was. And if you go there and dig, you can still find shards of glass. Way back up on top of the hill was the hotel, which was clearly visible from the road, and other locations will give you a fix on where that was. This was the first hotel, really, and it was luxurious. I can tell it was large, and it also was a pumping station for many thousands of gallons of water. A little closer to Sheldon Village, and right adjacent to Sheldon Junction, was the Vermont Springs. Now, the Vermont Springs had been discovered prior to the building of the Vermont House, but really hadn't been developed to any extent until the end of this craze, when someone saw an opportunity to make money. They built the Vermont House to accommodate the springs, and it was only a short jaunt from down here in the village by where the train was up to the springs. This, in reference to Vermont House and Vermont Springs, which is up here a little ways, is what we called Central Spring. Central Springs was to the east of Central Street, which still exists today. The spring still exists today. Okay, it is in the village of Sheldon. This being Main Street with the town clerk's office, this being Bridge Street, okay, up and over. This being the Lamoille Valley Railroad, bringing people into Sheldon. One of the other big hotels later on happened to be one that is right over here, and that one we will show you in a little while. That was the Portland House. Continental Springs is still in existence. It is one that was out on a hillside between what would be North Sheldon, which is right here, and that's the current intersection of Route 105 and 120. So North Sheldon Bridge, okay, down across the bridge is the Kane Road. Between the Kane Road and the East Sheldon Road on top of the hill is Continental Springs. Continental Springs provided water into this noticeable creek, which came to the edge of the Kane Road. And at the edge of the Kane Road, through about 1950, there was a spring house that was used primarily for agricultural purposes. Farms and farmers in the area at the need of water would come here and get water. It was never developed into a mineral spring for healing purposes, although in fact it was a mineral spring. After going through the spring house, it then went over and entered the Missisquoi River. This Continental Spring has been found. These two springs along Route 105 and the railroad tracks, this being the old plank road and the railroad tracks, and this being the railroad tracks, and this intersection right here is the current intersection of Route 236 going to Lake Carmi and Route 105 going to Amesburg. The Beers map clearly identified two springs, neither of which were developed for any commercial purposes, and neither of which have been found since they appear to have been found in 1871. The conjecture is that when the old plank road running from North Sheldon as a dirt and mud road was finally covered over, paved, and so forth, it was moved a little closer to the river, and indeed paved right directly over what would be those two springs, and so therefore they have disappeared. In this town of Sheldon map of 1871, there's one other spring that's been identified on the Beers map, and it's right up here. That's called Deer Lick Spring. It is on the Colton Road, top of the hill off of Route 105, going towards Franklin. It still does produce a trickle of water, but it was never very productive. And being as it was a considerable distance from this spring to a village to a rail station, it never could attract tourists, and so therefore it did not get developed. So the hotels that were associated with the springs were the Missisquoi Springs Hotel at the Missisquoi Springs, the Congress Hall at the Sheldon Spring, the Vermont House at the Vermont Spring, the Central Hotel at the Central Spring, and the Portland House in the village, which is still standing. There were other establishments built during this period of time to accommodate the nearly 2,000 annual summer guests who came over a 5-year period of time. Initially, it wasn't unusual for farm wives to house their children in the hayloft during the summer months so that they could sell guest rooms to tourists and therefore make money. Other entrepreneurs saw the opportunity to build great structures which would attract tourists, including tourists from Europe, as a way by which to make money, and through the advertising that occurred, produced a considerable amount of tourist traffic in Sheldon between around 1870 and 1900. This is Missisquoi as it was seen in the late 1800s. This was the first of several structures that were proposed to be built on this particular site. The view is from the road, and way down below here is where the spring is, and this structure was pretty magnificent. And further information as we get into the details of it, but it was a luxury hotel. This was Congress Hall. This one is of particular interest to me, in as much as it's right directly across the street from where I currently live. The Congress Hall was built by a partnership of a businessman and a doctor out of New York. It was a 3.5 or 4-story tall structure, and it had lots of rooms in it. We've got the dimensions of it. It stood really only walking distance from the rail station in Sheldon Springs, and therefore drew quite a crowd of people over time. This is the Vermont House. It was the last of the hotels to be built. It was built mostly in a field to the east and north of Sheldon Village. This is the side of the building that overlooked the Missisquoi River. You can see the transportation of the day being horses and buggies. This one housed a number of people and was considered to be one of the better houses. This is the Central Hotel, about which we know some things, but not nearly enough. It was supplied water by Central Springs. It had water, it had bathing, it had all kinds of things associated with it, typical of the time. This is what we call the Old Portland House. You can see this is horse and buggy days. The Old Portland House was built such as it was because the railroad coming through, which we eventually got to know as the Champlain Valley Railroad, was originally the Portland to Ogdensburg Railroad, which ran from Portland, Maine to Ogdensburg, New York, and transported considerable commodities of goods from the ocean port of Portland into Ogdensburg, where it could be reloaded on ships that were sailing on the Great Lakes, and so therefore it was a industrious and profitable railroad. One of the things they needed was to be able to provide accommodations for people, including their own people, so they built a hotel at Portland House. Eventually went into private hands, and then on Thanksgiving Day, of 1901, there was a plumber working there who accidentally left his torch burning in the basement of a hotel. As a result, it caught fire and burned down. And the next year, there was a new Portland house with all of the accommodations built for tourists during the mineral water craze. This is the only structure which continues to exist. When it was rebuilt in the early 1900s, it was really at the end of the mineral craze. The Missisquoi Spring had been purchased by someone who was using it for the purposes of bottling water, and people could still use that water as well as other water, but this wasn't the main attraction of the time. And so as it proceeded through the 1900s and through about the 1950s, it was a hotel. There was an entertainment facility for local residents. All kinds of things from presentations and meetings to band concerts and dances occurred here. As we continue down this road of looking more closely at this mineral water craze and this tourist boom, we will take a look further into more detail about the Congress Hotel and the Sheldon Springs, the Vermont House and the Vermont Springs, the Missisquoi Hotel and Springs, the Central Springs and Hotel, one called the Bellevue Hotel, which ended up on Lake Champlain, and the Portland House we've already talked about, as well as a number of other hotels that occurred in and around Sheldon in order to accommodate the tourist trade. The springs that are the ones that used to feed the Missisquoi Hotel are still there. In 2017 and 2018 exploration by the Sheldon Historical Society and a geologist discovered their location and sampled them. The Vermont Springs is still there, and it does produce a good deal of water. We will actually at some point get some and show it to you. That was the Sheldon Springs I'm talking about. The Vermont Springs is on private property, but the owner is not particularly remiss about people going there, and it does still produce water. And it has been tested and sampled within the last 2 years. The Central Springs continue to flow. They are not used any longer, but there are several springs a short distance off Central Street which produce the water. Now, in addition to that, we do know that the Continental Springs are still producing water, but none of the other springs that have been mentioned appear to be producing any water. So we will delve into greater detail into this particular time in Sheldon history over the next several weeks. Thank you very much for your time, and we hope that this has been informative and enjoyable for you.